The heat in the village was heavy, the kind that sat low on the chest and made everything feel slow, even time. The air shimmered above the dusty road, and children ran barefoot, kicking a ball made from bundled rags and dreams. A goat bleated from the corner of a yard, and the distant rhythm of a fan turning without wind echoed from an open window. It was the kind of place that didn't often make the news, and when it did, it was never for the right reasons. But today, someone had come. He didn't bring a parade. He didn't want cameras. Manny Pacquiao walked through the streets with a quiet familiarity, his face weathered not just by fights in the ring, but by years of learning how to walk as a man after fame had tried to carry him too high. He stopped every few meters, bent to greet a child, shook the hand of an old woman, took a photo only when asked. People looked at him not like a celebrity, but like someone they'd grown up watching, like family. His presence wasn't loud. It was grounding, and then she came. She was small, thin like the wind could carry her if it wanted. Her skin was darker than the others around her, deep brown with soft eyes that held a kind of silence too old for her age. Her hair was matted at the ends, the way it gets when time and survival matter more than combs or ribbons. She walked straight toward him, ignoring the others. No smile, no hesitation. Just a gaze that looked not at Manny Pacquiao the boxer, the senator or the millionaire, but at the man. He noticed her immediately. She stood out, not just because of her skin, not just because she wasn't from here, clearly, but because she carried herself like she was on a mission. He bent down slowly, as he had done for dozens of children before, and smiled. In his hand, a small sweet, a wrapped candy from a local shop. He offered it. She didn't take it. "I've never really eaten," she said. He blinked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like thunder. At first he thought he misheard. He tilted his head and asked her to repeat. Her eyes didn't change. Not properly, not a meal, ever. There was no drama in her tone, no attempt to exaggerate. It was a statement, like saying her name or the time of day. "I've never really eaten." Something inside him clenched. He'd heard children say they were hungry. He'd given meals before, donated rice, funded shelters. But this was something else. She wasn't asking. She was telling him a fact about her life, one that shouldn't have existed. He looked at her again, truly looked. She was 10, maybe. Could have been younger. Her arms were impossibly thin, her collarbones sharp under the neckline of a faded pink shirt. And yet she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just standing there, waiting for the world to decide what to do with her truth. Memories hit him hard, the pavement he used to sleep on. The nights he would fight not just in the ring, but against the emptiness in his own stomach. How he used to split a single piece of bread between himself and his siblings. How hunger wasn't pain, it was presence, a thing that stayed with you like a shadow. But never, not once, had he said the words she just had. "I've never really eaten." Because even then, he'd had something. He stood up, slowly, and without a word, scooped her into his arms. She tensed for a second, unused to being held. Then she let herself rest. No one around said anything. No one dared. The moment wrapped itself around them like silence made solid. He began walking, past the small crowd, past the dusty corners and peeling walls, until he reached a modest eatery with plastic chairs and an open kitchen. He nodded to the woman behind the counter. "Feed her," he said simply. The woman stared, then nodded. A plate was brought out. Rice, chicken, egg, vegetables. Hot steam rose into the air. He set Ayanda, though he didn't know her name yet, gently onto a chair. She looked at the food like it was a painting she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch. Pacquiao sat beside her, not eating, not speaking, just waiting. She picked up a spoon, awkwardly, slowly. Her first bite was small, like a test. Her eyes widened. Second bite, faster. Third, hungry now. She chewed with disbelief. Halfway through the plate, her eyes welled up. But she kept eating. No sounds, no words, just the clinking of spoon on plate and the quiet undoing of a hunger too deep for anyone watching to truly understand. He watched her eat, not like a man satisfied with a good deed, but like someone watching a life being rewritten, bite by bite. There were no cameras then, no stage, no charity banners, just a girl, a meal, and a man who knew exactly what it meant. Later, the stories would come, the photos, the headlines. People would call it inspiration. They'd use words like heartwarming and viral. But for Pacquiao, it wasn't a moment to be captured. It was a mirror, because in her face, he didn't just see hunger. He saw himself. Not the champion, not the senator, the boy, the one who used to pray for rice. And in feeding her, he wasn't saving her, he was remembering. The world had already begun to turn when the video surfaced. A single, grainy clip shot by a backpacker who happened to be eating nearby. No edits, no dramatic soundtrack, no framing. Just a handheld phone camera catching a girl in a worn pink shirt, speaking 6 words that held the weight of a generation. "I've never really eaten," she said. And then Manny Pacquiao, former champion of the world, knelt, lifted her into his arms and walked her toward food. Nothing more. And yet, nothing less. It spread like wildfire, first in Southeast Asia, then in Europe, then America. People paused at their desks to watch it once, then again. Something about the simplicity, the truth in her face, the rawness in his silence. It shook people. This wasn't a press event. There was no announcement. No branded T-shirts or glossy infographics, just a girl who had never eaten and a man who refused to let that continue. But viral moments fade unless someone anchors them to action. And Pacquiao, who had lived his whole life turning pain into momentum, refused to let this be just another emotional spike in a scrolling feed. The next morning, while the world was still trying to process what it had seen, Manny was already back on the street. No entourage, no podium, just him, a notebook, and a list of names. He found her again. The girl. Her name was Ayanda. She was Somali, though she didn't remember much about Somalia. Her mother, she said, used to sing to her in the mornings. Soft songs, in a language that no one else around here knew. She died in a fire 2 years ago. Ayanda never knew her father. She had wandered from shelter to shelter, village to village, often alone, sometimes with other kids who disappeared as quickly as they arrived. No papers, no records. To the system, she was invisible. She had never really eaten, because there had never really been a home. He took her hand again, but this time not just toward food. He brought her to a temporary clinic first, then arranged for a safe place to sleep. One phone call after another. One door opened, then another. But for Manny, it wasn't enough. Ayanda was one of hundreds, no thousands. He knew this. He'd seen them all his life. And something inside him refused to let this moment end in a single meal. He called it Mesa Pacquiao. Not a foundation, not a formal organization, just a name, a table, his table, a promise. That no child within his reach would ever again have to say what Ayanda said. He started with 50 kids from shelters, streets, abandoned lots, makeshift homes. He didn't ask for documents, he didn't care about origins. All he asked was, "Have you eaten today?" If the answer was no, they were in. A building was cleared out, an old training hall he once used when preparing for a title fight. It still smelled like sweat and memory. Now it smelled like rice, eggs, chicken stew. He didn't advertise it, he didn't ask for donations. He simply hired local cooks, gave them steady wages, and told them, "Cook like you're feeding your own child." Ayanda was there every day, at first quiet, still adjusting to the concept of certainty. That food would come not just once, but again and again. Her eyes softened over weeks. She gained weight, yes, but also light. Her laughter, hesitant at first, returned. She began helping with smaller kids, guiding them to the table, showing them how to use utensils, how to trust. Then the press caught on. News anchors wanted to know more. Who was the girl? What had she said? Why had this boxer-turned-politician turned his entire life on its axis for one meal? Manny rarely spoke publicly about it. When pressed, he simply said, "She reminded me who I was, who I am." But others began to speak. A chef from Cebu sent word. He wanted to start a mesa in his city. A footballer in Lagos said he would adopt the same model. A jiu-jitsu champion in Brazil reached out. Quietly, without fanfare, Manny Pacquiao became not a brand but a movement. Meanwhile, Ayanda continued to grow, not just in body but in voice. She started school for the first time, learned to write in Tagalog and English. Her accent was soft, her handwriting uncertain, but her curiosity was fierce. She wanted to know why things were the way they were, why she was left behind, why no one had seen her before. One day she asked Manny directly, "Why did you come back for me?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because I was afraid no one else would." That night, she stayed silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "Me too." Manny began visiting the mesa locations every week. He'd sit, not as a guest, but at the table with the children. He served food, wiped spills, told stories. The kids didn't care about his championship belts. They called him Tito Manny, Uncle Manny. The government tried to regulate it. NGOs wanted to claim it. Sponsors offered money, branding deals. Manny refused most of it. The point, he said, was not to build an empire. The point was to build a habit, a table that stayed. Still, as the network grew, so did the logistics. Volunteers came, some from nearby towns, others from abroad. One was a nurse from Norway, another a poet from Ghana. They came not to be heroes, but to learn what a quiet revolution looked like. One meal at a time. And at the center of it always was Ayanda. She became a symbol, yes, but also something more, a teacher, because through her, people were reminded of something uncomfortable, that hunger isn't always loud, that sometimes the most devastating truths are said plainly without drama, that a child saying, "I've never really eaten," should be enough to move the earth. And it did. But for Manny, the work was only just beginning. Every new child reminded him of the boy he had been, of the night sleeping in boxing gyms, skipping meals to train. He remembered what it felt like to be forgotten, and now he swore no child within reach of his name would ever feel that again. Ayanda once said, "The day I ate, I stopped being invisible." And Manny knew that's what it was really about. Not just food, but dignity. Not just hunger, but recognition. Because a plate of rice doesn't change the world, but a plate of rice, offered by someone who sees you, who truly sees you, that can. 2 years passed. The world moved on in the way it always does, shifting its gaze from one story to the next. The headlines faded, the viral clip was buried under newer content, and most people who had cried watching the girl say, "I've never really eaten," had forgotten her name. But Ayanda had not disappeared. She had simply begun to live. Her days now started with something she had never known before. Routine. Breakfast was warm, familiar. Eggs, rice, sometimes a piece of fruit. There was no shock in having food anymore, only gratitude. She shared a small home on the edge of a residential area in Davao, built through private funds arranged by the Manny Pacquiao network. She had a bed with blue sheets, a shelf with second-hand books, and a mirror she sometimes stared into, as if still surprised she could see herself. She was 12 now, though part of her still felt younger, or older. Time had stretched strangely in her early years. Trauma does that. But she was safe. More than that, she was growing. She spoke Tagalog fluently and had learned English well enough to read aloud. She had a quiet intelligence, the kind that didn't shout but listened. Teachers at the small community school often spoke about her calm presence. Other children came to her with their questions, their fears. It wasn't that she had all the answers, it was that she never dismissed them. Manny visited less frequently now, not out of absence but necessity. Manny Pacquiao had grown far beyond the borders of Davao. What began as one man feeding one girl had turned into a constellation of safe spaces, over 100 across Southeast Asia, with whispers of expansion in East Africa and South America. Not franchises, not businesses, just tables, just meals. Other athletes joined quietly. A retired Muay Thai fighter in Chiang Mai opened a mesa in a gym. A Kenyan long-distance runner built one outside Nairobi. A jiu-jitsu champion in Sao Paulo offered free classes in exchange for volunteer hours in his mesa. Each one had a story of hunger, of loss, of rising, not despite the pain, but because of it. And yet, the core remained unchanged: dignity before charity, presence before pity. Food was the symbol, not the end goal. Recognition was the revolution. Ayanda knew this. She began volunteering at her own mesa every afternoon after school. She helped prepare the plates, supervised the younger children, and sometimes simply sat beside newcomers who didn't know how to speak. She would place her hand gently on theirs just once and say, "It's okay. You're here now." She still remembered the day she said those 6 words. Sometimes she wished she hadn't been filmed. It felt strange, knowing the world had watched her lowest moment. But other times, she understood. If it hadn't been captured, she might not be alive. There was a fragile balance between shame and salvation in being seen. Then came the invitation, a formal letter signed by officials inviting Ayanda to speak at a humanitarian summit in Manila, not to perform, not to read a speech written for her, but to share her story in her words. At first she refused. Public speaking was not her strength. But Manny called her gently and said, "You don't have to tell them what happened to you. Just tell them who you are now." And so she went. The auditorium was filled with adults in crisp suits, translators in booths, volunteers in matching shirts. Ayanda stood backstage, clutching a small piece of folded paper. She hadn't told anyone what she planned to say, not even Manny. When her name was called, the lights softened and the applause rolled like distant thunder. She stepped out alone, wearing a simple dress, hair in a loose braid. She looked out over the sea of faces. She didn't see cameras. She didn't see senators or ambassadors. She saw people, like her, hungry once or still. She opened the paper and read the first line, then folded it again and placed it back in her pocket. "My name is Ayanda," she said. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. 2 years ago I told a man I had never really eaten. That was true, but what I remember more than the food was that he listened. He believed me. She paused. That day something happened. I didn't just eat. I felt seen. I felt real, like I wasn't floating anymore. Silence. You can feed someone once and walk away, but when someone stays, when they make space at their table for you every day, that's love. Then she held up a small drawing, crayon on paper. It showed a long table with many children around it. In the center, a man with boxing gloves on the floor beside his chair, smiling, and next to him, a girl in pink. This is the day I started living. The room erupted, not in claps at first, but in stillness. That kind of breathless stillness that only truth can cause, then applause, then tears. Manny walked on stage and hugged her tightly. He whispered something that only she heard. She nodded, smiling through tears. In the weeks that followed, the clip spread again. This time not of a girl in need, but of a girl transformed, and the movement grew. Manny Pacquiao expanded further, but more interestingly, it changed form. Some tables became mobile food trucks. Others became community gardens. In one case, it became a floating kitchen on a river in Vietnam. The format didn't matter. The heart did. Ayanda continued her life with the same quiet grace. She wanted to study social work, not to rescue people, she hated that word, but to walk beside them, to remind them they were not invisible, that sometimes it only takes one person seeing you to remind you that you are real. She kept the drawing framed above her bed. On harder nights, she would look at it and remember not just the hunger, but the moment it ended. And more importantly, what came after. Because the world loves a redemption story. The media thrives on before and after images. But Ayanda's story wasn't just about one meal. It was about what happens when someone decides that one act of empathy should never stand alone. She never forgot what it felt like to speak those 6 words. And Manny Pacquiao never forgot how they felt when he heard them. In the end, this wasn't the story of a boxer saving a girl. It was the story of a girl saving a man from forgetting what really matters, and of a table that became a revolution.